Welcome to the fourth episode of Behind the Algorithm, where we explore the human and philosophical layers behind technology. From AI ethics to digital culture, we unpack the ideas, biases, and unintended consequences shaping our tech-driven world. Our guest today is Fiaz Sadiq, a seasoned innovation and growth specialist with a rich background in entrepreneurship and mentoring. Before we get into it, Fiaz, would you like to briefly introduce yourself to the listeners?
Greg, thanks for having me. Bit of context, life wasn't always like this. I'm married for 20 years with two lovely daughters, 17 and 13. I run in the hills, Ashtanga yoga. But as I mentioned, life wasn't like this. So to give you a bit of context, my journey started in technology and software at a time 30 years ago when move fast and breaking things was the ethos. I've since built, scaled and exited tech companies, and through those experiences, one theme has constantly stood out: the tension between speed and substance, between short-term wins and long-term meaning. That's where Cathedral thinking comes in. You see, in one of my early ventures, we built a brilliant piece of software, but we treated it like a startup tent, not a cathedral. We didn't build it with the foresight that it might shape an ecosystem that taught me that real impact demands long-term thinking, not just among your team, but through your entire value chain, your suppliers, your partners, even your users. It's about planting a seed whose tree you may never sit under.
I love that. Very poetic. Thank you. Today we're obviously talking about cathedral thinking. That's the name of the episode. So let's start at the root. Fiaz, what does cathedral thinking mean to you, and why does it matter in an age of accelerating technology and digital disruption?
Thanks, Greg. Really good questions to start off with. For me, cathedral thinking is about building with intention, humility, and long vision. It's creating something not just for the new product cycle or fiscal year, but for generations beyond us. In an age where disruption is glorified and speed is currency, it reminds me as that true innovation is just fast, it's foundational. I've built and exited software and tech businesses, and one of the most humbling lessons I've learned is that unless you think beyond the now, you risk creating tools that burn bright and die young. Cathedral thinking invites us to slow down and ask, what are we truly building and for whom?
I love that. You talk about the intention and humility, and you're very passionate about the purpose rather than the exit. And I think that there's a lot to be said for thinking more long term than this short term focus on the valuation. So, and as someone who's built businesses and exited them, you're very well placed to advise on how companies should be integrating purpose into their business plan, perhaps. But look, let's get on to the next question. So looking historically, cathedrals took generations to build. What modern parallels do you see, if any, in the world of system design, infrastructure, or national strategy?
Yeah, I've certainly seen glimpses in things like global companies that are building, but more countries, the kind of infrastructures that means to evolve but to endure. But perhaps the closest parallel is national strategy in places like China, Japan, Hong Kong, where they're thinking ahead. Their approach is they look at AI infrastructure, they look at economic diplomacy, and I don't see it as a tech race, they see it as a 150-year strategy. Why many Western systems are optimized but don't speed. But China's governance, education, technological investments are built with multi-generational milestones in mind. That's cathedral thinking at a national level. And you look at Japan, what happened when the tsunami happened many years ago. They know where they live, they know what's going to happen, but very easily in thinking ahead, they realize some of these natural disasters are going to happen in a lifetime. And they had the infrastructure and the foresight and the governance to come back even stronger.
Yeah, and we haven't been eating radioactive fish. So you obviously talk about China, and that's interesting because the concept of their kind of geopolitical play was to become the next superpower over the next, I think, was it 10 years? I can't remember. Xi Jinping's last inauguration, he talked on stage about their long-term vision, and their long-term vision was to displace US as the global superpower. And they've been doing that across technology, commerce, their Belt and Roads initiative. So they are actually laying the foundations for something that will probably see fruition in the next, well, I think it was 10 years, but it's probably going to be a bit longer right now that Trump's hit them with all those tariffs. But they I think, came to power due to our short-term thinking. So the West outsourced all of their manufacturing to China, which then enabled China to become an incredibly wealthy and powerful country. Those tariffs that are now put on China are as a result of them not having any tariffs for the last however many 50 years or so. So that the West has now sort of woken up to the fact that actually, we've enabled China to become the global powerhouse for manufacturing, and enabled them to build very strong coffers to do some of the infrastructure projects that they're doing across Africa and South America in those Belts and Roads initiatives. And then beyond that, with technological advancement, with things like with companies like ByteDance, which is obviously in constant contention with the West. That goes on to sort of the next question, which is that China has now become the long-term strategic partner on the geopolitical stage, but also in planning for AI and infrastructure. So what can the West learn from some of that thinking?
Where it's in the political sphere right now is to learn, temper its obsession with exits and raising. Not everything needs to be built to IPO or flip. China's historical approach and many of the cathedral thinking is influenced by long-term thinkers and strategists. Understanding of dynastic sustainability, shows us how to integrate continuity into innovation. Imagine if startups in the West were built like Chinese companies that think in 150-year cycles and 100-year. It shifts a perspective entirely. You're not just designing software, you're shaping culture, behavior and legacy, and that ties in nicely into, in the Western world, we live in a society that is about need and want. And the last thing we miss out is purpose. In the China, and you look at Toyota, how it's built, they start with building people, not building products. That's legacy that stayed. So they start with purpose, then want, and then need.
That is interesting. You talk about if startups thought in 150 years, God, imagine how difficult it would be to raise. It's bad enough to raise at the moment, let alone you're not going to see any returns for 10, 20, 30 years down the line.
Yeah.
But obviously when we look at China, we look at how their government has a hand in every company.
Yeah.
Everything lends back to the state. So it's a statewide mandate, and all of the companies that come through have to toe the line. We obviously live in a very different society to that, so it would be very difficult for all startups to follow that same approach. But I do agree, if we did consider the long-term ramifications of what we're building and the purpose behind it, rather than the exit or rather than the revenue generation, we'd have a lot more useful technology products out there that aren't doing so much damage to society. I want to talk a little about the news cycle, and I want to talk a little bit about this whole sort of short-term thinking. And I want to ask, how does populist political cycles and market-driven tech ecosystems in the West inhibit this idea of long-term thinking? And do you see any ways around that?
Yeah, I mean, coming back to just firstly to the previous comment about businesses and looking at 20-year cycles, that's not sustainable. But what if we could create a cycle that was less around quarterly earnings, fundamentally assigned with long-term strategy? It's like constructing a cathedral while being forced to show progress every 90 days. That's stress. That's not having that critical thinking, long-term planning. And if you look at the burnout, and I do agree, with China, the communist approach, have everything in there where we're free, what we do. I mean, we learn lessons from each other. This isn't pointing out one's better than the other, but it's learning from, what are people doing, what's working. So having independent foundation, patient capital, mission-led organizations as anchors. If we want to build for generations, we need pockets of economy that are insulated from short-term noise. Places where vision can be protected long enough to grow roots. And that's the key. What are we planting? Is it giving chance to really grow? Take a tree, it needs to grow its roots before it can start getting taller. What are the winds? What are the seasons that are going to come along? Nobody can predict, and we haven't been able to predict in the last 6,000 years what winters are going to come. How many winters are we going to have? How many summers? We'd love to say, actually, do you know what? I'll have 3 springs and I'll have 2 summers, maybe 1 autumn, but forget about winter. Unfortunately, we can't change that. So what's the light? What have we got? We've got the tools, we're better. And there's some great things happening in digital, better health systems, better diseases, how we adapt to things. But behind all this, it's all driven by product. What if it was driven by purpose? And at the centre it was people.
Love that. The less long-term quarterly reporting I have to do, the better. The less quarterly reporting I have to do, the better. It does shift thinking, oh, if this isn't working for 3 months, let's move over to the next thing. If that doesn't work for 3 months, let's move over to the next thing. And I think the same applies. We're seeing it now in politics at the moment. The Labour government have only been in for less than 6 months, I think. And they are getting bombarded every day with the mistakes that they've made, some of them warranted, some of them not. But you have to see these things play out. I remember hearing on the radio after Truss's disastrous stint as Prime Minister that actually if you'd have let her economics play out, they would have been successful. Now, I'm no economist, so I don't want to hold my hands up to that. But the short-term impact of that was devastating to people with mortgages because it shot interest rates up. But I remember listening to an economy podcast and they said actually the maths was sound, and if you'd have let it play out, it would have actually done some real good. But because of the short, sharp shock that the society felt from it, she was out, she was gone, and now we're seeing the sort of ramifications of those terrible mistakes. So there was not, and I'm not saying that what she put up was right or not, but this idea of short-term thinking does mean that if something's not going right for that 3 months or for that year or for that 6 months, then we burn it and we start afresh, we burn it and we start afresh. And maybe some of those ideas are led with purpose, but because they're not showing returns, we shy away from them.
I think you're right. Things get played out, and it's interesting, for a government to make that decision, and Liz Truss, for any government to make a decision, how are they supporting that bedrock? Because if they could have supported, the mortgage side or the foundational side of the ecosystem and said, actually, this is a 3-year plan, maybe people have got a chance to breathe and pause and go, this is the long term. And I think that thinking and institutes, how we do that is having that kind of open source community and having a commitment to help them values precede valuations.
Values precede valuations. I love that.
Where the mission outlasts the founders or the government. These are the modern temples of thought that help that practice, still carving a stone in digital age. And we've seen it, we talk about China, but there's other things that happen where at the long term, and we talked about, if what we know now today about tobacco, we would have never done it. If we knew now in the next 10, 15 years about vaping and what that means, or whatever that is, but actually we're in a digital age that's probably been 20 years, it's coming to 30, and we know some of the things they're having. And I keep coming back to this, isn't it time we let the light in?
I love that notion of letting the light in. Do you think there's any public or private organisations that are still that are capable of cathedral thinking, despite the constraints of the short news cycles that we live in and the requirement for businesses to have to show these sort of 3-month reporting cycles?
Yeah, one of them is Let My People Surf is Patagonia. You only have to read that story. There you go. You just, he was a blueprint for a lot of way he did, and the way he did it, even, he sold that, back to purpose, back to the people. And their purpose always, the long-term purpose of Patagonia was all around helping natural earth and natural fibers and using the best and giving back to people. That brand now outlives. Now I'm saying that's just one story. Look at Toyota. Okay, in fact, let's look at Japan first. They realized probably 100 years ago, and they did this strategy around, we've got an aging population but a diminishing young population. How are we going to manage this? These people are living longer, and more importantly, how do we keep that wisdom? Think of walking in a forest when the old oak trees and the cedar trees you see and think, this is magnificent, okay, but you still want to walk in a garden where the roses and the small spring trees and so forth. So Japan thought that actually long term are going to need, if people are living longer, they're going to need to be assisted, and they did a whole a strategy around robots and how they could help. And now they're leading the world on that, and aren't we learning more and more? Amazon are using them, we're using different things. So what I'm actually saying is digital has helped if we do it the right way with purpose.
Yeah, I love that you keep coming back to that idea of purpose before profits. So you obviously talk about robots, we talk a bit about geopolitics. Do you think that true cathedral thinking is possible in the software and digital infrastructure world?
Keep coming back to this, and hopefully I've been very fortunate to look into different mindsets and what that needs. So the temptation in tech is always what version, what patch, what iterate, and that It's fine for features, but we're talking about purpose. So we need a digital bedrock. Think about TCP, IP protocol. Today we talk about AI, blockchain. These actually, when you look behind it, those are still just protocols and foundations of the internet, and it has been for decades, and it will carry on. So that's cathedral thinking, but not glorified. So cathedral thinking is possible in software and digital and robots if we start building core frameworks with permanence and interoperability in mind.
Yeah, that interoperability ones, that's one of the biggest challenges for digital ecosystems, right? If they don't connect with each other, you then have these pockets of organizations or individuals that are used to using one gateway to access whatever it is. I'm actually thinking of the analogy of being phones, right? You have people who go to Apple and they never turn back, or you have people who are Android and they won't cross-pollinate. You'll rarely see, if someone's an Android user or a HTC user, which is Android interface, they'll stay that, and if you have someone on iPhone, they'll stay that, partly because they make them closed ecosystems where it's very difficult to get your stuff out of it. But we see that a lot in B2B tech, where you have certain platforms which are interoperable with everything. Like if you have CRM systems, for example, there's lots of technology that's built to optimize and augment them. But you see it's so the tech world is so fragmented. How do you ensure cathedral thinking is ubiquitous among technology so that you have one streamlined solution for everything within tech rather than all these different protocols and all these different software platforms? Is that even possible?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at open source blockchain, they are just modern cathedrals, and there is the spiritual cathedral thinking, but people can tap into that and so forth. But what it does lack is that planning, that forward thinking, and how do we build that? Rather than it being a strength, we're actually building Achilles heel. So if you're going down the Apple route, the Android and different, we're actually not opening up that. So why can't we have, look at blockchain. It has a cathedral ambition. It's decentralized. It's got borderless. It's got great foundation. But without long-term culture cohesion, these systems can crumble under their own weight. So building community governance, ethics, and come back to this shared person. Just remember, it's not just code that we're trying to build. And that is opening up something around allowing people the tools to find the information. But here's important. These tools with the algorithms are helping us or directing us of certain thinking ways, certain algorithms. If you see a certain post, it'll keep putting a post. It could be far right, it could be left wing, it could be anything. But what if we could create an algorithm and actually help to pause? And I talked this earlier on, Greg. One of the big things that I'm seeing, I mentioned Philips, or tell the story of Philips, is the reason they're really working hard is because 20 years ago they realized their tech team, the real inventors, were actually losing that ambition and purpose. So actually they came around saying, okay, we need to pause. What is it that you like doing as a passion? They like drawing, art, community work. So we move from the need and want to purpose. So purpose driven will bring that intention to grow. And one of the key things I'll say in this, when's the last time you actually unplugged from your phone?
Never. I've never unplugged from my phone.
And that.
No, I've not since we had them. It's on now. I'm getting messages. We, for the sake of our listeners, we did record this once, and we didn't press the record button. So this is the second iteration, and some of the stuff that Fiaz is alluding to is stuff that we already spoke about in our previous version of this, which didn't make the cut because we didn't record it. And we talked a lot about the purpose. We talked a lot about how companies like Philips are creating room for employees to find their own purpose, which then in turn drives more productivity. And then I would imagine more profitability. And then we talked about how blockchain, in its purest sense, could become the foundation for a modern day digital infrastructure, because it has all of the use cases. One of the things that we probably haven't touched on in this is how, in our previous one, is how capitalism can only go so far, and we can only grow so much. So there needs to be purpose before profit. And if companies in their earnings report, now you see that they have to put ESG up front. So in their earnings reports, should they be looking at impact? Should they be looking at impact over revenue or impact alongside revenue? And then we started looking at, well, current business models struggle to allow for that. So is it possible to bring in something like blockchain where for certain projects, for certain campaigns, for certain business units, you can create DAOs where if you're then able to invest back into stakeholders. I remember I was at COGEX for a few iterations, and McKinsey were on stage talking about stakeholder capitalism and how, I think actually because you touched on Patagonia's founders kind of book, and the notion or the ideology of stakeholder capitalism is kind of embedded in this without having that fancy phrase. The idea of stakeholder capitalism is if you give benefit to not just the shareholders but everyone involved in your business, whether it be the person that's cleaning the toilets or whether it be your actual customer at the end of the day, and they all have you all have a shared community around the brand, the product, the service, whatever it is, you will in turn be a more profitable, more productive business. And there's a lot to be said for that, but current business models don't allow for it. So maybe blockchain, because of its DAOs and because of its tokenomics frameworks, could allow something like stakeholder capitalism, which when McKinsey were talking about it like 5 or 6 years ago seemed ridiculous because there's no infrastructure to build around it. Maybe blockchain could be the answer to enabling businesses to see beyond profit and actually look at monitoring and scaling for impact and purpose.
And it comes in really, AI is a mirror. If you think about it, it reflects the values we train it to. So if we feed it short-term data and KPIs, it will optimize for speed and scale and clicks. But what if we thought something different? What if we embedded long-term goals, sustainability, health, education, social equity? AI can become a cathedral tool too, and so can blockchain. Imagine models that simulate urban planning 2 years out of our ecosystem that reward patient capital, as you mentioned, rewarding the community. The potential is there, but the intention must come first from stakeholders. And there's many ways of doing that. And it touches on this. Are we actually losing our ability to debate and long-term thinking and critical thinking because we're looking for short-term wins and short-term 90-day plans? And that's an interesting dilemma to look at. So what are we feeding the machine?
No, completely understand. So we've got AI to predict for your example, future displacements or planning strategy, and we've got blockchain to create a sense of equitability for anyone involved in that project, for the wider stakeholders of that project, of that business. And then we did touch on the previous conversation that we had around the negative impacts of how technology is causing negative impacts to our ability to communicate, to think, to understand, which is a struggle and a conversation all in itself. It's a shame that they didn't come through on this one. So we won't dwell on it, but I will ask the question. There's a real cultural shift behind this, both for business and for society. So what kinds of cultural and educational shifts do we need if we want technologists and leaders of organizations to adjust their thinking to purpose and not just exits and valuations and revenue?
Yeah, good question. If we think, and I will come to this question, but if we think, we've been to the industrial age era, we're at the digital era, but actually right now we're in the community era where people want to look at long-term vision, sustainability, community. So I think we're in an age of where we need to reframe success. Success is not defined by funding rounds, acquisitions, personal branding. But what if we taught technologies to measure impact over time, community benefit, ecosystem resilience? And what if our education systems introduce not just agile methods, philosophical inquiries? We need ethics courses alongside coding boot camps and mentoring programs that don't just teach how to build, but why to build. And that just adds a whole different perspective on moving forward with purpose. And I keep coming back to purpose because I think what's happened is our lives, rather than be 3D or 4D, have become on this small screen that manages our health, our thinking, our decision making, and even our conversations with family. When was the last time you actually said, hold on, how can I stop, pause, and actually move slower so I can move faster?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm glad you brought the need for us to have, alongside coding. My partner's kids are both at school, and her boy is very studious, maybe soon to be engineer, very invested in coding, really wants to pursue that. But I don't ever hear from her, alongside his coding courses, an ethics course. I think, yeah, we're so busy trying to build that we don't, as you've said, think about the purpose of what we're building and why we're building it. So that educational shift has to come from people understanding the morality of what we're doing. I did a Harvard course a little while ago on political philosophy, and it was absolutely fascinating, and it really opens your mind up to very different ways of thinking. And I think that we should all go through that in this modern age to understand the needs for guardrails, the needs for why what we're consuming online, the way that they're interacting with technology should be legislated, regulated, and monitored. So that we do allow these breaks in our day where we're not glued to our phones, where we understand the content on it, all this kind of stuff.
Yeah, and that unplugging, is really hard. But that critical thinking, I think as a generation, and I'm talking about the generation now that's going to be in another 20 years' time, have we lost how to debate? Have we lost how to actually think outside the box because the algorithms are helping us go down a digital road or a digital motorway or a digital city and helping us live there and creating that virtual, because all my opinions are being fed by algorithms and they're all correct. When have I actually looked round the corner and gone, I wonder what somebody else is thinking? Young, old, different, accountant.
Yeah.
It's just an interesting, it's very much about what the brand is, who you are. And this takes me back to the very early days, and I was fortunate enough to be in the .com days, and we've seen it in the SaaS model age, and we're coming to the AI age. But programmers and software developers started to become the pop stars. Okay, they could have what they want. I was seeing people that one day were coming out of university and the next day they were on a 500k salary with a whole board, wherever, which is all great. But is that really cathedral thinking? Because all them people are burnt out and there's many other things. So as a cultural society, what are we creating? Are we creating out burnout, or are we wanting to plant seeds?
Very, very. I love the way that you're articulating some of this stuff. And actually, your Freudian slip there, I don't think was wrong. You said thinking outside the box rather than thinking outside the box. I actually think for a Freudian slip that's very apt, considering what did I read the other day, that we don't realise how pernicious, that's not the right word, how pervasive the use of ChatGPT is now. So you talk about losing the ability to debate, or losing the ability to be able to create content of our own volition rather than relying on an algorithm to do it for us. And there's a lot of biases baked into ChatGPT's DeepSeek, Perplexity, that if used unguarded could shape how we think about the world, our ideological stance, because we're relying on that to produce content for us rather than creating it of our own opinion. We might give it a little look over, but actually some of that biases is being baked in. So the notion of unplugging, thinking outside the box, if we're not careful, we will lose it. And that is definitely not cathedral thinking, because those companies have not thought about the purpose, which is to so it's terrible, optimize society. It is optimizing society, but in the very short term. But actually there's proof to show that the amygdala is getting smaller. You mentioned in our previous episode that we didn't film that thumbs might get bigger in future ages. Anxiety is going up, ADHD is going up, all sorts of challenges and issues.
And I think you touched on some alarm. This is a personal story, is that I've got a 17-year-old daughter and a 13-year-old who've come into the digital age. But actually what's happened is watching my older daughter go through that from 13 to 17. And at 13 it was a very rocky time. And it was all digital, and she was impressed by the algorithms that were happening and what were happening. But today we live with her, and she went through a very dark phase, and there was a very dark phase. But actually, as a family, looking about cathedral thinking and putting them roots in, she was wanting the wanting and the needing, but we tried to shift that to the purpose. And today, as I mentioned, she now works one day at Oxfam, which actually she's really enjoying. She now wants to write a book of what she went through to help other people, and that's growing seeds. And I'm going to give this credit to a very good friend, James Akrim, who was the technology director for Microsoft for many years. He put a great word, and it's only come this week, is maybe we should all start looking at curiosity with purpose. And I'll give that credit to James.
I love that. If Andrew Grill is listening to this podcast, who has written the book Digitally Curious, it might resonate with him. His book I've got behind me as well.
Fantastic.
So your penultimate question, if you had the opportunity to lay the first stone of a new digital cathedral, something that would outlive you, what would it be and who would you start building it with?
I think it's a really good question, and there's many ways, but I think what I'd like to say is, I think the one thing we talked about is purpose, but what if we could have a cultural infrastructure, a system that mentors future leaders to think deeply, build responsibly, and collaborate globally. Something that unites diverse thinkers from engineers to artists, philosophers to financiers under one shared vision to build a better future we may never see. I want to build it with people who challenge me, young minds, old souls, curious skeptics, and courageous dreamers, because no cathedral is built alone, and no lasting legacy is built without love or passion.
You would really get on with my friend Stephanie Antonian, who I interviewed for my first podcast, who we've done many talks together, and she goes on stage and she talks about what society needs is more love. And we've presented a few times together, and we were at a very well-known London university, whom I won't name, and she said exactly that. What we need is more love in the world. People have very, very low self-esteem. That's why they get into going down these rabbit holes and they end up hating themselves. Not all of us, we all do it. And she said what we need is more love. And the moderator turned around and said, can you give us a more tangible example than love? Her response was, there is nothing more tangible than love. Love is the only thing that we need.
Yeah, I'll share this one story. This has come so during the actually it was one of a colleague. He was a lecturer at Leeds University from the Netherlands, came over, and he was looking for purpose, and he had this passion that he wanted to create a community cafe and cook community and so forth. And he had this really great job at and you know, we coached him and said, okay, what would that look like? And actually what's really interesting, this happened before the pandemic, 2 years. In the pandemic, okay, he and I donated half of my wealth because I needed purpose in life. It was one of the best things I've done in my life. But he created, working with the food that was being thrown into landfills, a community with 150 volunteers. And it's on record, it's Sheffield Foodworks. And he created 320,000 meals. Because in that society, cathedral thinking, when people were feeling lonely, there was volunteers that were dropping food outside their table. There was people, community, that was a bedrock of that is what love is. And I'll leave you with that thought.
I love that. And do you know what? I've just found Foodworks, Sheffield Foodworks, and I will share it in the description of the episode so that people can get onto it. Last question for you, Fiaz, and thank you very much for joining us. Who would you invite to the next podcast?
I think I gave it away a little bit, but I think James Akring, he's a technologist. He's seen the whole age from start to finish. I think his way of curious with purpose, I think, will be fantastic. So I will be no doubt speaking to James Akring. I think it'll be good.
I love that. Little pause there was just for the thing. I'm going to stop it there.